The sun slowly dips behind the thatched rooftops of a small medieval village, casting long shadows across the dirt pathways. The vibrant colors of the day fade into deep shades of indigo and black. A cool breeze stirs the leaves of ancient oaks, and the distant lowing of cattle echoes softly. This is the hour when the medieval world begins to transition into its strange and often misunderstood nighttime rhythm. For most of us in the modern world, the coming of night is a rather uneventful shift. We flip a light switch, close the curtains, and tuck ourselves into bed with an assurance that safety and comfort will carry us through the night. But for the people of the medieval period, the arrival of darkness brought about a world filled with mystery, danger, superstition, and peculiar habits shaped by necessity and belief. The medieval world, which stretched roughly from the 5th to the 15th centuries, lacked many of the modern conveniences that we take for granted today. Electricity, street lights, centralized heating, and sturdy locked doors were absent from most people's lives. As the sun set, a different kind of world emerged, a world dictated by candlelight, moon phases, and the ever-present fear of what lurked in the shadows. The night in medieval times was not merely a period of rest but a distinct chapter of daily life, full of its own customs, activities, and apprehensions. The rhythms of sleep, the roles of religion, the fears of supernatural forces, and the practicalities of living in a world that went completely dark, influenced behaviors in fascinating ways. One of the first and most obvious differences between the medieval night and our own is the sheer absence of artificial light. Once the sun vanished below the horizon, there was only the pale glow of the moon, or the dim flicker of candles and oil lamps to push back the dark. Street lighting was virtually non-existent except in the wealthiest urban centers, and even there, it was rudimentary at best. The inky blackness would swallow villages whole, making it nearly impossible to travel or work outdoors without great risk. This complete lack of light created a world where nighttime was deeply intertwined with danger. The darkness concealed everything: lurking animals, hidden thieves, wandering strangers, and, in the minds of many, the malevolent forces of the supernatural. Medieval people believed that spirits, demons, and witches were especially active at night. These fears were not dismissed as mere superstition, but were woven into the very fabric of daily existence, influencing prayers, rituals, and even how homes were built and secured. As the darkness settled in, families gathered around their hearths, the flickering flames casting long shadows on the stone or wooden walls. The fire was more than a source of heat, it was a protective barrier against the unknown. Stories were told, tales of saints and sinners, heroes and monsters. These narratives served both as entertainment and as cautionary lessons for the young and old alike. The medieval night was also deeply spiritual. Monks and nuns in monasteries adhered to strict schedules of prayer that often included nighttime vigils. The ringing of bells signaled the canonical hours, such as matins or lauds, drawing the devout from their slumber to offer prayers in the darkened chapels. For laypeople, night prayers were a routine part of bedtime, offering a sense of protection and comfort against the uncertainties of the dark. Interestingly, the way medieval people slept differed from our modern expectations. Rather than one long, uninterrupted stretch of sleep, many followed a pattern known as segmented or biphasic sleep. They would have a first sleep, followed by a period of wakefulness, and then a second sleep. This time of wakefulness in the middle of the night was often spent in prayer, quiet conversation, or even small chores. It was not unusual for neighbors to visit one another during this period, and for couples, it was a private and intimate time. The structure of homes also reflected the peculiar needs of nighttime. Poorer families often shared a single room, with beds made of straw stuffed sacks laid directly on the floor or on simple wooden frames. Wealthier households might have canopied beds with heavy curtains to keep out drafts and offer privacy. Multiple family members often shared a bed for warmth and safety. Travelers and guests might be invited to share sleeping quarters as well, a practice that would seem highly unusual to modern sensibilities. Night was also a time for certain types of work. Bakers, for example, might begin preparing their dough during the night so that fresh bread would be ready for the morning. Brewers, Blacksmiths and other tradespeople sometimes worked into the late hours if their crafts demanded it. However, these activities were generally reserved for enclosed and well-lit spaces, as venturing into the open was risky. Beyond the immediate circle of family and work, the medieval night held dangers that were all too real. Thieves and bandits often operated under the cover of darkness, taking advantage of the limited visibility to plunder homes and attack travelers. In towns and cities, night watchmen patrolled the streets, armed with lanterns and cudgels, tasked with maintaining order and catching wrongdoers. These watchmen often shouted out the hours, not only to mark the time but also to deter crime by making their presence known. The elements themselves posed their own threats. Without modern insulation and heating, homes could become bitterly cold during the winter months. People bundled themselves in layers of woolen blankets, huddled close to one another, and relied on the residual heat of the hearth to stay warm. Illnesses such as pneumonia, influenza, and the common cold were frequent visitors during the long, frigid nights. For those who struggled with sleep, whether due to anxiety, illness, or the myriad discomforts of medieval bedding, there were remedies both practical and bizarre. Herbal concoctions, prayers to saints known for aiding sleep, and even magical charms were employed in the hopes of securing a restful night. Lavender, chamomile, and valerian were commonly used herbs believed to promote relaxation and drowsiness. Throughout all these peculiar habits and routines, one thing remained constant: the medieval night was a period of vulnerability and mystery. The absence of light, the ever-present threats, and the deeply ingrained superstitions created a complex tapestry of nighttime culture that is both foreign and oddly familiar to us today. While modern technology has banished much of the darkness from our lives, allowing us to extend our days into the late hours with ease, the people of the medieval world navigated their nights with a mix of caution, faith, and community spirit. Their habits, though shaped by necessity, reflect a profound adaptability and resilience. As we continue our journey through the strange nighttime habits of medieval people, we will delve deeper into the specific practices and beliefs that defined their nocturnal existence. From segmented sleep to bed-sharing customs, from night watchmen to supernatural fears, the world of the medieval night is a captivating study in how humans have always sought to find comfort and security in the face of darkness. When the final glimmers of sunlight dipped beneath the horizon in the medieval world, they left behind something far more complete and oppressive than anything most modern people have ever experienced. Today, our world glows in an artificial twilight even after sunset, with the constant buzz of streetlights, neon signs, house lamps, and glowing screens ensuring that true darkness remains a stranger to us. But for those who lived between the 5th and 15th centuries, darkness was an almost physical presence, total, inescapable, and deeply unsettling. For a medieval villager, darkness wasn't merely an absence of light. It was a force that transformed familiar spaces into alien landscapes. The woods beyond the fields, which by day might provide game or firewood, at night became ominous stretches of blackness, where unknown creatures and sinister spirits were believed to roam. Even the short walk from a neighbor's house back to one's own cottage could feel perilous after sunset. The boundaries of the known world contracted sharply once the sun vanished, reducing the safe world to the small circle of light from a flickering flame. The absence of widespread artificial lighting made medieval towns and villages dramatically different at night than they were during the day. Narrow dirt streets that were bustling with people, livestock, and merchants during the daylight hours fell eerily silent after dark. The few who dared to move about did so quickly, cautiously, and only when necessary. Candles, oil lamps, and rushlights provided some illumination, but their glow was weak and fleeting, barely strong enough to light a single room. For the wealthy, beeswax candles offered a slightly brighter and more consistent flame, but they were expensive and out of reach for most commoners. Instead, the average peasant family relied on cheaper tallow candles, made from animal fat, which burned with a dim, smoky light and filled rooms with a strong, unpleasant odor. Even these had to be used sparingly, as candles were valuable and not easily replaced. Many households limited themselves to one candle at a time, often shielding it with a metal or ceramic lantern to prevent drafts from extinguishing the fragile flame. Rushlights, even cheaper than tallow candles, consisted of dried rushes dipped in fat or grease. They produced a feeble, flickering light that might last only 10 to 15 minutes. Families might keep several on hand for the course of the evening, but their limited lifespan meant that careful planning was needed to ration them. Entire households would gather around the single light source, huddled close, conducting all nighttime activities within that small illuminated circle. The limitations of these primitive lighting methods shaped not only household routines, but also social norms. After sundown, most people confined themselves indoors, avoiding unnecessary trips outside. Travelers often timed their journeys to ensure arrival at a destination before nightfall, knowing the risks of being caught on the roads after dark. Inns and monasteries offered refuge for those who found themselves far from home as darkness approached. For those who lived in larger towns or cities, the experience was somewhat different, though no less unsettling. Some wealthier towns might employ a limited form of street lighting, typically oil lamps or lanterns hung at key intersections or near important buildings. But these were rare and poorly maintained, often providing more comfort in theory than in practice. More often, cities relied on night watchmen, who patrolled the streets with lanterns, calling out the hours and watching for signs of trouble. Their lanterns created small, moving islands of light in otherwise engulfing darkness. The dangers of the night were not only imagined. Criminals took advantage of the darkness to carry out thefts, assaults, and other misdeeds. In some towns, strict curfews were imposed to limit movement after sundown. Anyone found wandering the streets after curfew without a legitimate reason risked arrest or worse. The watchmen were often feared as much as respected, wielding considerable authority over those caught breaking nighttime laws. In rural areas, darkness amplified fears of both human and supernatural threats. Wolves, bears, and other wild animals roamed closer to human settlements at night, emboldened by the cover of blackness. While actual attacks were relatively rare, the possibility was enough to keep villagers indoors and vigilant. Livestock were brought into pens or secured barns before dusk, while dogs were left loose to bark at any approaching danger. Superstition played a significant role in how medieval people experienced the night. The hours of darkness were believed to belong to witches, ghosts, demons, and other malevolent forces. Many believed that these beings gained strength and freedom under the cover of night, and that wandering souls or evil spirits could snatch the unwary. Protective charms, holy relics, and prayers were common defenses against these unseen dangers. It was widely believed that demons prowled the night seeking to cause mischief or harm. The devil himself was thought to prefer the shadows, tempting souls in their weakest moments. Tales of incubus and succubus demons, who visited sleepers to steal their strength or lead them into sin, were common. Sleep was not simply a natural act of rest, but a time of spiritual vulnerability. The psychological weight of darkness in medieval times cannot be overstated. Without easy means to dispel it, darkness became not just a physical condition, but a state of mind. The unknown that lurked just beyond the flicker of the candle flame played on the human imagination, feeding fears that had been passed down through generations. Even within the relative safety of the home, families took measures to guard against both physical and spiritual dangers. Doors were barred with heavy wooden beams. Windows, if present, were shuttered or covered. Beds were often enclosed with heavy curtains to trap warmth and ward off drafts, but some also believed they offered protection from evil spirits. Prayers were said before sleep, invoking saints and angels to watch over the household until morning. The design of medieval architecture further reflected the realities of darkness. Windows were small and few in number, both for insulation and security. Many buildings had only one main living area, where the entire family gathered, ate, worked, and slept together, maximizing both warmth and safety during the vulnerable hours of the night. The moon played a powerful role in shaping medieval nights. On clear nights with a full moon, visibility improved dramatically, allowing limited outdoor activity. Farmers might check on their livestock, travelers might press forward a little longer, and watchmen had an easier task patrolling the streets. But moonless nights, or those clouded over, were utterly black, magnifying the sense of isolation and risk. The changing of seasons brought additional challenges. In winter, the darkness stretched for long, oppressive hours, beginning in the late afternoon and lingering well into the morning. Entire evenings were spent huddled near the hearth, performing quiet tasks, telling stories, or simply trying to stay warm and safe. In summer, the nights were shorter, but the darkness no less absolute when it arrived. The combination of natural danger, superstition, and practical limitations made medieval people highly conscious of the rhythm of day and night. The rising sun was a daily deliverance, banishing the fears of the night and bringing light, warmth, and safety. Morning prayers often included thanks for surviving the perils of the darkness. Medieval literature, art, and folklore are filled with references to the danger and mystery of the night. Tales of nocturnal encounters with witches, werewolves, and ghostly apparitions filled the imaginations of peasants and nobles alike. The night was not a neutral time, but a living presence, one that demanded respect and caution. The transition from day to night marked a profound psychological shift in medieval society. Unlike our world, where electric lights allow us to defy nature and extend the day indefinitely, the medieval night was a strict boundary, an unavoidable reminder of humanity's vulnerability and dependence on the natural world. While some might romanticize medieval life with images of candlelit banquets and moonlit strolls, the reality for most was far more sobering. Darkness was a formidable adversary, one that could hide predators, expose one to supernatural forces, and amplify every creak of the floorboards into something potentially sinister. And yet, despite these challenges, medieval people adapted with remarkable resilience. They developed customs, protections, and even social structures that allowed them to coexist with the darkness, even if they could never truly conquer it. The flickering candle, the tightly shuttered window, the whispered prayer before sleep, all were acts of quiet defiance against the vast, unrelenting night. As we continue our exploration of the strange nighttime habits of medieval people, we will see how these conditions shaped not only their fears, but also their most basic routines, including how they slept, how they prepared their homes, and how they tried to guard against both worldly and otherworldly threats. The image of sleep we carry in modern times is rather straightforward, one continuous stretch of slumber, lasting roughly 7 to 9 hours, preferably uninterrupted. We lie down at night, fall asleep, and awaken in the morning, ready to begin the day. But for medieval people, sleep was not a singular, continuous event. Instead, it was often divided into two distinct segments, separated by a period of quiet wakefulness that filled the gap between them. This fascinating pattern, known today as segmented sleep or biphasic sleep, was a natural consequence of the world medieval people inhabited. With no artificial lights to extend the day, and with the darkness of night descending early and lasting long, their sleep was governed directly by the rhythm of the sun and seasons. As a result, their nights were often longer than our own, creating space for this unique division of rest. The first sleep typically began not long after nightfall. After the evening meal, families would gather around the hearth, perhaps say evening prayers together, and then gradually drift off to sleep. The house would quiet down as the fire dimmed, and the entire household would settle into their first round of slumber. This first sleep often lasted for 3 to 4 hours. It was generally a deep, restorative sleep, where the body began its repair processes, and where many people would experience their most vivid dreams. After this period, however, something curious would occur: people would naturally wake up. This was not seen as insomnia or a disruption, but as a normal part of the night's rhythm. The period that followed was called the watch or the waking period. During these hours, often lasting 1 to 2 hours, people would engage in a surprising variety of quiet activities. Some would remain in bed, lying awake, praying or reflecting. Others might sit by the low embers of the hearth, rekindle a small flame, and perform minor household chores that required little noise or light. For couples, this period offered valuable private time, often used for intimacy. In fact, Several medieval medical texts even recommended this period of wakefulness for conceiving children, believing that the body was especially well suited for it after the first sleep's rest. Neighbors might even visit one another quietly during the waking period, especially in smaller communities, where homes were close and relationships familiar. Quiet conversations, whispered gossip, and light tasks like mending, spinning, or shelling peas were all commonly done during this pause between sleeps. The fire was usually kept low, and only the barest flicker of light illuminated the room. Once the waking period ended, people would naturally drift into their second sleep. This second round of rest would continue until dawn or until the crowing of roosters signaled the approach of morning. Unlike the first sleep, which was deep and restorative, the second sleep was often lighter and filled with dreams of a more fantastical or spiritual nature. Historical references to this segmented sleep pattern abound in medieval documents, literature, and even medical texts. In his 13th century writings, the philosopher Thomas Aquinas casually mentioned first and second sleep as a matter of course, as though it needed no further explanation. Likewise, in the 15th century French poem Le Livre du Chevalier de la Tour Landry, there is a reference to rising after the first sleep to engage in prayers. Such references suggest that this practice was widespread and widely accepted across different regions and classes. But why did this pattern emerge? The answer lies in both biology and environment. In the absence of artificial light, the body's natural production of melatonin, the hormone that regulates sleep, is triggered by the onset of darkness. Medieval nights could easily stretch to 12 or even 14 hours, especially during the long winters. It would have been unnatural to sleep straight through such a long period without waking. Thus, the body naturally settled into this two-part rhythm. Modern sleep researchers, who study segmented sleep, have found that, in conditions without artificial light, many people spontaneously adopt this same pattern, suggesting that it may have once been the norm for humanity. In fact, some historians and scientists believe that segmented sleep represents a more natural or ancestral sleep rhythm, one that was altered only by the advent of widespread artificial lighting in the modern era. The watch period between first and second sleep was not simply a curiosity, but also served important social and spiritual functions. In a world where religious faith permeated daily life, many people used this quiet time to pray. Some recited psalms or whispered Ave Marias, asking for protection from the many dangers associated with the night, both earthly and supernatural. For monks, nuns, and clergy, nighttime prayers were even more structured. Monastic communities adhered to strict schedules of canonical hours, specific times for prayer throughout the day and night. The midnight vigil, known as matins, required them to rise from their beds in the cold, dark hours to gather for communal prayer. This religious discipline mirrored, in some ways, the segmented sleep of laypeople, though for monks, it was far more rigorous and spiritually focused. The waking period was also a time when fears could surface. Without the distractions of daytime work, the silence of the night allowed worries to rise. Concerns over poor harvests, illness, family disputes, or personal sins could haunt the mind in these quiet hours. For this reason, many people turned to prayer as a source of comfort and mental peace. The existence of segmented sleep also influenced how medieval people perceived dreams. Dreams occurring during first sleep were often viewed as physical or related to bodily health, while dreams during second sleep were thought to carry more spiritual or prophetic significance. Dreams of saints, angels, or deceased relatives visiting in the early morning hours were sometimes interpreted as messages or warnings from the divine. Medical beliefs of the time even incorporated segmented sleep into health advice. Physicians writing in the medieval period sometimes recommended that patients struggling with certain ailments should adjust their sleep patterns to include a deliberate waking period. They believed that this allowed the body to digest food more thoroughly, prevented humors from stagnating, and promoted better overall health. The presence of segmented sleep also shaped the household environment. Beds were often shared, not only by spouses but by entire families. In some cases, even guests or servants shared sleeping spaces, especially in poorer households, where separate rooms were a luxury few could afford. During the waking period, people might quietly step over one another to tend to the fire, check on livestock, or even briefly step outside to relieve themselves. Outside of homes, the waking hours could also serve the community. Night watchmen made their rounds, calling out the hour or checking for signs of trouble. Bakers began their work in the early hours, using the quiet darkness to prepare dough that would be ready for the morning crowds. In larger towns, some markets even opened in the pre-dawn hours, catering to early risers eager to secure fresh bread or dairy before the rest of the town stirred. Interestingly, the rise of segmented sleep also played a role in the development of certain folk beliefs and superstitions. The waking period, when people were conscious yet vulnerable, was considered a time when supernatural forces might be at their most active. Tales of witches flying through the night, or spirits visiting sleeping households found fertile ground in this context. Protective charms, such as placing iron under the bed or hanging sprigs of herbs, were often employed to guard against such threats. Over time, as society advanced and artificial lighting became more widespread, segmented sleep gradually faded from common practice. The Industrial Revolution, with its strict work schedules and the introduction of gas and electric lighting, reshaped sleep into the single block of rest we now consider normal. But for centuries, medieval people lived by a rhythm far more attuned to nature's cycles, one that embraced the darkness rather than trying to banish it entirely. Today, many people who suffer from insomnia or nighttime wakefulness unknowingly experience echoes of their ancestors' sleep patterns. Modern sleep research has even suggested that adopting elements of segmented sleep can sometimes help individuals who struggle with rigid, uninterrupted sleep expectations. In this way, the medieval practice of first and second sleep serves as a reminder that our ancestors adapted to their environment with remarkable flexibility and creativity. Far from being troubled by waking in the middle of the night, they accepted it as a natural, even valuable, part of life. When modern people imagine sleep, they often picture the comfort of their own private bed, tucked away in a personal, climate-controlled bedroom. Privacy, space, and solitude are the assumed standards of a good night's rest. Yet, for most people in medieval Europe, this vision would have seemed wildly luxurious, if not entirely alien. The act of sleeping was often a communal experience, shared not just with immediate family, but frequently with extended family, servants, apprentices, friends, and even complete strangers. The concept of sleeping alone was, for many, impractical, unnecessary, or even suspicious. Medieval homes were typically small, simple structures built of wood, wattle and daub, or stone, depending on the region and wealth of the owner. The primary living space in a peasant's home often consisted of a single room that served as kitchen, dining room, living room, and bedroom all at once. In this one room, family members lived out their daily routines and retired together at night. The warmth of shared bodies was a practical necessity, especially during the harsh winters, when fires would be banked low to conserve fuel. Beds themselves varied widely depending on one's social standing. Wealthier families might have large, raised wooden frames with thick feather mattresses, fine linens, woolen blankets, and elaborate canopies to trap warmth and provide a sense of enclosure. These grand beds were often valuable family heirlooms, handed down through generations. But for the majority of medieval people, a bed was far simpler, sometimes no more than a straw or hay mattress laid directly on the floor, covered with rough woolen blankets or animal skins for warmth. In these cramped spaces, it was normal for entire families to sleep together. Parents, children, and sometimes even grandparents would share the same bed or sleeping platform. Younger children were often nestled between adults to keep them safe and warm. Infants frequently shared their mother's side, especially for ease of nursing during the night. This proximity allowed for constant supervision of small children, whose survival was always precarious in a world where infant mortality rates were tragically high. Servants, apprentices, and extended family members often joined as well, particularly in larger households. In manorial estates or merchant homes, it was common for apprentices to sleep at the foot of their master's bed, always close at hand for early morning work. Servants might sleep on benches or mats nearby. Privacy was a rare commodity, and sleeping arrangements reflected a social structure that prioritized communal living and shared responsibility over individual comfort. Bed sharing extended beyond the family unit when circumstances demanded it. In inns and taverns, it was entirely routine for travelers to share a bed with strangers. Many inns provided only a limited number of beds, and guests paid simply for the right to a space in one of them. A weary traveler might find himself nestled shoulder to shoulder with merchants, pilgrims, or soldiers he had never met before. The notion of paying for an entire room or bed solely for oneself would have been considered extravagant in many cases. The famous medieval English writer and pilgrim Geoffrey Chaucer makes several references to shared sleeping arrangements in the Canterbury Tales. Pilgrims traveling to holy sites often bunked together in communal dormitories or inns, where strangers quickly became temporary bedfellows. In such settings, personal boundaries were necessarily relaxed. People learned to sleep while wrapped tightly in their own blankets or cloaks to avoid accidental or unwanted contact. There was a practical aspect to these sleeping habits that extended beyond space constraints. Shared body heat was an important defense against the cold. Medieval homes were poorly insulated, and heating relied heavily on open hearths or primitive braziers. Fires were dangerous to leave burning overnight, so most homes would let them die down before bed. The more bodies packed into a space, the warmer it stayed. Sharing a bed was not merely cultural, it was survival. Social status, of course, played a crucial role in who shared beds with whom. Nobles might share beds with peers of equal rank when traveling or negotiating alliances, as bed sharing could symbolize trust, equality, and even political intimacy. Royal visitors might share a host's grand bedchamber as a gesture of hospitality and closeness. In some cases, even monarchs shared beds with courtiers or foreign dignitaries during diplomatic missions. Bed sharing was also closely tied to hospitality customs. In a culture where inns were scarce or expensive, travelers often relied on the generosity of locals for lodging. Offering a place in one's bed or home was an expected act of kindness and community responsibility. The guest might sleep alongside family members, farmhands, or other guests, all packed into the available sleeping space. Refusing to share a bed with a guest could be seen as inhospitable or even insulting. Of course, not all instances of bed sharing were purely practical or innocent. Proximity often created opportunities for intimacy, whether consensual or otherwise. In monasteries, boarding schools, and castles alike, cases of inappropriate conduct occasionally surfaced. Church authorities often issued warnings against the temptations that could arise from unchaperoned bed sharing, particularly among unmarried individuals. At the same time, bed sharing was also viewed as an opportunity for bonding. Friends traveling together, siblings, or even soldiers on campaign often spoke of the camaraderie that developed through sharing a bedroll or mattress. Trust and companionship were fostered in these close quarters, where personal space was willingly sacrificed for warmth and security. The psychological landscape of medieval bed sharing was vastly different from our own. The modern emphasis on privacy, personal space, and individualized comfort did not dominate medieval thinking. Sleep was a communal affair, deeply embedded in social networks, survival needs, and cultural expectations. One's place in the bed often reflected one's place in the household hierarchy, parents in the middle, children on the edges, servants at the foot, and guests wherever space permitted. Medieval medical theories even addressed bed sharing. Physicians advised on which sleeping positions and arrangements best preserved health and avoided the spread of illness. For instance, it was believed that sleeping too close to another person's breath might expose one to miasmas, unhealthy airs thought to cause disease. Others argued that sharing body heat helped ward off chill-induced illnesses. Illness also complicated sleeping arrangements. When a family member fell sick, they might be temporarily isolated from the communal bed, if space allowed, to avoid contagion. But in cramped peasant homes, isolation was often impossible. leaving entire families vulnerable to the spread of disease within the household. The church, too, weighed in on sleeping customs. Monasteries, for example, carefully regulated how monks shared sleeping quarters. Many monasteries featured large dormitories, where dozens of monks slept in rows of narrow cots, monitored to ensure order and celibacy. Even here, the rule of bed sharing sometimes prevailed during overcrowded periods. Children, especially among the poor, were accustomed from infancy to sleeping in crowded beds. From their earliest years, they learned to share space, remain still, and accept the constant presence of siblings or other family members nearby. Crying infants were quickly hushed to avoid disturbing others, and older children were expected to adjust to cramped quarters with minimal complaint. Interestingly, some wealthier families began to introduce limited privacy into sleeping arrangements by the late medieval period. The rise of separate bedchambers for married couples, servants, and guests marked the slow emergence of private sleeping spaces. Four-poster beds with heavy curtains provided some privacy even within a shared room. Yet, even then, total solitude while sleeping remained rare outside of monastic or aristocratic circles. As cities grew, so too did inns and lodging houses, many of which still practiced communal sleeping, but now charged fees based on the number of bodies sharing the bed. Travelers often preferred to sleep with companions or trusted acquaintances when possible, reducing the risk of theft or personal harm. Even so, horror stories of being robbed or harmed by bedfellows circulated widely. The gradual shift towards solitary sleep did not become widespread until much later, driven by factors such as wealth, urbanization, better heating, and evolving cultural ideas about personal space. The Industrial Revolution, once again, played a major role in transforming sleep culture, standardizing work hours, creating private bedrooms in middle-class homes, and finally severing the ancient traditions of shared sleep that had dominated for centuries. Today, the idea of climbing into bed beside a stranger feels deeply uncomfortable for most people, yet for medieval folk, it was simply one more way to navigate a world of limited space, harsh climates, and deeply interconnected social lives. Their willingness to share beds reflects not only the physical realities of the time, but also a social fabric woven tightly together by necessity, trust, and community. As the sun dipped beneath the horizon, and darkness crept across the medieval world, a transformation took place inside every home. Daytime routines came to a halt. The clatter of tools, the hum of conversation in the fields, and the noise of market squares faded into stillness. But before anyone could think of resting their heads, there was always a flurry of carefully rehearsed nightly preparations. For medieval people, nighttime brought not only rest but also risk. The hours after dark were filled with dangers that daylight had kindly kept at bay: thieves, fires, roaming animals, supernatural beings, and illness. To survive the long hours of the night, households had to prepare methodically, performing a kind of nightly ritual that balanced comfort with vigilance. The process began in the final hours of dusk. The evening meal was served early, often just before sunset, as preparing and eating food after dark was difficult and hazardous without adequate lighting. Candles, oil lamps, or simple rushlights provided weak, flickering illumination, their flames vulnerable to drafts and costly to maintain. Once the meal was cleared, tools and utensils were washed, dried, and stored away to avoid accidents. Even a simple misstep in the dark could lead to dangerous injuries. The fire in the hearth, central to every medieval home, was the heart of nightly preparation. While it provided warmth and a bit of light, it also posed the greatest risk of catastrophe. A house fire could consume an entire home in minutes, especially when structures were made of timber, thatch, and wattle. So each night, household members would carefully bank the fire. This meant covering the embers with ash to keep them smoldering safely until morning. In many regions, specific tools, iron covers, pots, or lids, were used to suffocate the flames without fully extinguishing them, allowing for an easier rekindling the next day. The phrase, "covering the fire," became so entrenched in nightly life that it even found its way into prayers and superstitions. Many families would recite protective prayers while banking the fire, invoking saints or angels to safeguard the household from flames, storms, and evil spirits that might exploit the night's vulnerabilities. Doors and shutters were secured next. Unlike the sturdy, lockable doors of modern homes, medieval doors were often simple wooden planks, sometimes reinforced with iron if the household could afford it. Heavy wooden bars were drawn across doors to keep them closed against intruders or wild animals. Windows, small and often unglazed, were covered with wooden shutters to keep out the cold, wind, and any prying eyes that might lurk outside. In wealthier homes, additional layers of security might include iron grills over windows or reinforced gates at the entrance to the property. Nobles and merchants, conscious of their wealth attracting thieves, often hired private watchmen or guards to patrol their homes during the night. In towns and cities, some neighborhoods organized their own night watches, groups of men who patrolled the streets calling out the hour and warning of any dangers. Inside, the house was inspected for anything that might cause harm while people slept. Sharp tools were placed out of reach. Water buckets were filled and kept close to the hearth in case a fire reignited. Animals such as chickens or goats were secured in sheds or pens. Dogs, valued as both companions and guards, were often allowed to roam freely inside or near the home at night. Their keen senses acted as an early warning system against approaching danger. But not every danger of the night came from men or beasts. Many medieval people feared supernatural threats just as much as physical ones. The darkness was believed to be the favored domain of ghosts, witches, demons, and wandering spirits. To protect themselves, families employed various charms, amulets, and rituals. One common practice involved hanging protective symbols near the bed or doorways. Crosses, herbs like rosemary or lavender, and iron objects were thought to repel malevolent forces. Some placed bowls of salt at the threshold, believing that evil spirits could not cross such barriers. Others hung bundles of garlic or wore small pouches containing written prayers or holy relics as a personal shield against the dark. Certain superstitions focused on mirrors, which were rare and valuable but feared for their potential to trap or reflect spirits. It was common to cover mirrors at night or turn them toward the wall to prevent unwanted visitors from using them as portals. As families settled into their beds, additional measures ensured safety through the night. Parents kept small children close, both for warmth and for protection against sudden illnesses like fevers or night terrors. The oldest and most vulnerable members of the household were also given central spots in the bed, where others could attend to them if needed. The medieval night was not silent. Outside, the howls of wolves, barking dogs, and hooting owls pierced the air. Travelers moving after dark risked encounters with highwaymen or wild animals. City dwellers heard the calls of watchmen echoing down narrow streets, announcing the hours or warning of fires and disturbances. The sounds of the night were constant reminders of its lurking dangers. For wealthier urban households, nighttime security sometimes extended to elaborate curfews and regulations imposed by city authorities. Bells tolled to announce when residents should extinguish their lights and cease outdoor activities. Town gates were closed and locked to prevent outsiders from entering after hours. Guards stationed at these gates controlled who came and went, and anyone caught outside after curfew without good reason faced fines or arrest. In some areas, fear of fire led entire communities to ban certain nighttime activities. Bakers, whose early morning work involved stoking large ovens, were often forbidden to light fires after sunset without special permission. Chimney inspections and fines for unsafe hearths became common in urban centers, where the risk of catastrophic fires was greatest. Despite all these precautions, fires still broke out with alarming frequency. A single overturned lamp or stray spark could engulf entire neighborhoods of wooden buildings. Firefighting equipment was primitive at best. Buckets, hand-pumped water carts, and organized bucket brigades formed the first line of defense. In rural villages, neighbors rushed to help one another, while in cities, trained fire wards and watchmen coordinated the response. The risk of theft and violent intrusion was another pressing concern. With limited policing, especially in rural areas, many families relied heavily on their own vigilance. Men sometimes slept with weapons, daggers, axes, or even swords, within reach. Dogs and geese, surprisingly effective at raising alarms, provided additional warning. Some wealthier estates constructed defensive walls, or fortified gathouses as extra barriers against night raiders. Traveling at night was generally avoided whenever possible, but for those who had no choice, messengers, traders, or pilgrims, special precautions were taken. Traveling in groups offered protection, and many carried torches, cudgels, or even hired guards. Churches and monasteries often provided shelter to wayfarers caught out after dark, offering both safety and religious sanctuary. Illness, too, cast a long shadow over medieval nights. Without modern medicine, sudden fevers, coughing fits, or seizures often struck without warning. Families kept herbal remedies and holy relics close at hand, turning to prayer and folk medicine when sickness invaded the household after sundown. Not all nightly preparations were grim, however. There was a deeply human side to these routines as well. Families gathered for prayers, shared stories by the flickering fire, or sang quiet lullabies to their children. The end of the day offered a rare moment of togetherness, where the worries of the world briefly gave way to warmth, shared meals, and the comfort of being surrounded by loved ones. As the house finally quieted, and sleep descended, medieval people placed their trust in God, the saints, and the strength of their preparations to carry them safely through the vulnerable hours of darkness. And as the first light of dawn returned, households stirred once more, rekindling fires, unbarring doors, and stepping into a new day, thankful to have passed safely through another night. The medieval night was not just a time for sleep, it was a world unto itself, filled with mystery, fear, and strange happenings. In a time before science could fully explain the workings of the human mind, people often found themselves at the mercy of curious nighttime experiences that seemed to defy reason. Among these were sleepwalking, night terrors, and a host of other unusual nocturnal behaviors that puzzled, frightened, and fascinated medieval society. Sleep itself was poorly understood. To medieval people, it was not simply a biological function, but a delicate balance between the physical body, the soul, and unseen spiritual forces. Dreams were often thought to be divine messages, omens, or even visitations from the dead. And when people moved, spoke, or cried out in their sleep, it was seen as something deeply mysterious, sometimes natural, but often supernatural. Sleepwalking, known in medieval texts as noctambulism or wandering sickness, was both feared and marveled at. A sleepwalker might rise from bed in the dead of night, eyes open yet unseeing, and wander through the house or even outside, completely unaware of their actions. Neighbors might witness someone walking across rooftops, wandering into fields, or stumbling dangerously close to wells or rivers without ever waking. Without modern medical explanations, people often believed that sleepwalking was caused by possession, witchcraft, or the influence of spirits. Some thought the soul left the body temporarily during sleep and could become disoriented, or led astray by demonic forces, causing the body to follow in its absence. Others blamed lunar cycles, believing that certain phases of the moon could trigger wandering. Physicians of the time offered various remedies, some practical, others purely superstitious. Sleeping with iron under the bed was thought to protect against wandering spirits. Placing holy relics, blessed water, or protective herbs near the sleeper might anchor the soul and prevent nighttime excursions. In some cases, family members would tie the sleepwalker's ankle to the bedpost, or gently restrain them with ropes or weights. Night terrors were another disturbing phenomenon. Unlike ordinary bad dreams, night terrors involve sudden awakenings accompanied by screaming, intense fear, rapid breathing, and wild thrashing. Medieval observers, unfamiliar with neurological explanations, interpreted these events in dramatic ways. Many believed that such episodes were caused by demonic attacks, nightmares sent by witches, or the punishment of sinful behavior. The medieval concept of the incubus and succubus, malevolent spirits who visited sleepers to torment or seduce them, was often invoked to explain night terrors. Victims who awoke gasping for air, feeling paralyzed, or sensing an unseen presence pressing on their chest were said to have been visited by these nocturnal creatures. This experience closely resembles what we now call sleep paralysis, but for medieval people, it was evidence of spiritual assault. To protect themselves, many people developed nighttime rituals. Prayers to saints, especially Saint Benedict or Saint Michael, were common, as these figures were believed to have the power to ward off evil spirits. Charms inscribed with protective symbols, or holy texts were placed under pillows or around necks. Holy water sprinkled around the bed served as a barrier against demonic entry. In some regions, communities believed that certain people were especially vulnerable to nocturnal attacks, those born under unlucky stars, those who had sinned grievously, or those suspected of dabbling in forbidden magic. These unfortunate individuals might undergo exorcisms, confession, or public penance to rid themselves of their nightly tormentors. Sleep talking, or somniloquy, also puzzled medieval observers. While some dismissed it as harmless, others worried that a person speaking unknowingly in their sleep might accidentally reveal secrets, sins, or private thoughts. In certain cases, sleep talkers were accused of consorting with spirits or practicing witchcraft, particularly if their nighttime ramblings included unknown languages or strange phrases. Children were especially prone to strange nocturnal behaviors, and parents watched them with a mixture of fear and compassion. Bedwetting, sleepwalking, night terrors, and unexplained crying were all seen as potential signs of supernatural interference. Parents might seek the help of midwives, herbalists, or priests to protect their children. Lavender sachets, chamomile teas, and gentle blessings were common remedies used to calm restless young sleepers. Even dreams themselves were subjects of serious concern and interpretation. Medieval dream books offered elaborate guides for understanding the messages hidden in nightly visions. A dream of falling might signify a coming misfortune. Flying dreams could symbolize spiritual elevation or divine favor. Snakes, wolves, or dark forests appearing in dreams often pointed to betrayal, danger, or evil lurking in one's life. Some wealthier households even employed professional dream interpreters, clerics or wise women skilled in reading the language of dreams, to counsel them on what their nocturnal experiences foretold. For the deeply religious, dreams might serve as personal revelations from God, guiding moral choices or predicting future events. In monasteries and convents, sleep was also watched carefully. Monks and nuns adhered to strict sleep schedules broken by nighttime prayers called vigils or matins. Yet even here, strange nocturnal behaviors sometimes occurred. Monastic records occasionally mention brethren who wandered the cloisters while asleep or who were seen mumbling strange words during the night, leading to debates about spiritual warfare or mental affliction. Superstitions surrounding the causes of these behaviors were deeply rooted in the larger medieval worldview, which saw the night as a battleground between good and evil. Many believed that witches performed their dark rituals under the cover of night, sending curses or hexes toward unsuspecting victims. If someone began sleepwalking or experiencing night terrors after offending a neighbor, accusations of witchcraft were not uncommon. The church played a central role in addressing these fears. Exorcisms, masses, and blessings were called upon to free people from nocturnal disturbances believed to be caused by demonic influence. Priests might visit afflicted individuals, sprinkling holy water around the home, reciting prayers at bedtime, or advising on spiritual remedies such as confession and penance. Physicians, too, offered explanations grounded in the medical theories of the time, particularly the theory of humors. An imbalance of black bile, associated with melancholy, was thought to cause nightmares and disturbed sleep. Overeating, drinking too much wine, or consuming certain hot or cold foods before bed could disrupt the balance of humors and lead to troubling nocturnal episodes. As a result, dietary recommendations were sometimes part of the treatment. Light meals of bread, broth, or stewed vegetables were encouraged in the evenings. Heavy meats, strong cheeses, and rich sauces were discouraged. Herbal teas containing valerian, chamomile, or poppy were administered to promote calm sleep and prevent bad dreams. Despite these precautions, the mystery of nocturnal behaviors remained unsolved and often terrifying. Entire communities might become involved when someone's nightly episodes grew especially dramatic or dangerous. In extreme cases, sleepwalkers, who wandered into neighbors' homes, or who harmed themselves while unconscious, were seen as cursed, or even possessed. The landscape of the medieval night was filled with these anxieties, all wrapped tightly within a worldview that saw every event, whether waking or sleeping, as part of a grand spiritual struggle. Sleepwalking and night terrors were not merely strange occurrences, they were messages, warnings, or punishments from forces beyond the visible world. Today, we might see these nocturnal events as medical or psychological conditions. But for medieval people, they were threads woven into the great fabric of life, closely tied to faith, fear, and community. Each night was not just a time to rest, but a time to survive, against enemies both seen and unseen. As the first pale light of dawn crept across the medieval landscape, it signaled more than the start of a new day. It marked survival. To awaken safely after the long, dangerous hours of darkness was, in itself, something of a quiet triumph. But the medieval morning was not a leisurely affair. Instead, it unfolded in a series of deeply ingrained rituals, routines, and superstitions shaped by centuries of tradition, necessity, and faith. The day often began before the sun had fully risen. For many, the first waking moment was guided not by the soft comfort of rest but by obligation. Farmers, laborers, monks, and servants were all accustomed to rising with the roosters, or, in some cases, long before. In monasteries, for example, the call to matins, the first prayer service of the day, summoned monks from their slumber in the early hours, sometimes as early as 2 or 3 a.m., depending on the season. For ordinary folk, the first act upon waking was often a whispered prayer. Gratitude for having made it through the night safely was deeply felt, as was the hope for protection in the hours ahead. Many recited personal devotions or simple prayers taught from childhood, invoking the protection of saints or offering thanks to God for another chance at life. Before even leaving the bed, some observed small rituals to ward off lingering evil or bad luck that might have crept into the room during sleep. It was not uncommon to cross oneself, murmur protective phrases, or check that any charms left out overnight remained undisturbed. Superstitions advised against stepping out of bed, with the left foot first, as this was thought to invite misfortune for the entire day. Once out of bed, physical preparations began. In homes where multiple family members shared sleeping quarters, privacy was minimal, so the simple act of dressing was often done quickly and with modesty. In colder months, people slept in many layers, and in some cases, only small adjustments were needed before starting the day. Washing in the morning was a simple but meaningful act. Cleanliness carried both practical and spiritual significance. A basin of cool water was often used to wash the face, hands, and mouth. For some, this was accompanied by whispered invocations, believing that washing away the dirt of the night also cleansed the soul of lingering sin or evil. In wealthier households or monasteries, more elaborate washing routines might be observed, including scented water or the use of cloths soaked in herbal infusions like lavender, rose, or chamomile. But for most, water was plain, and towels, if they existed, were shared among family members. Teeth cleaning, though rudimentary, was not entirely neglected. Twigs, cloth, or small brushes dipped in salt or herbal pastes were used to scrub the teeth and gums. Mouth rinses might contain vinegar or herbal mixtures to freshen breath and promote health. The importance of good breath carried not just hygienic value, but social and moral weight, as foul breath was sometimes seen as a sign of inner corruption. Hair care was another small ritual. Men often kept their hair relatively short and easy to manage, while women might spend considerable time braiding or wrapping their hair, particularly if they were married and needed to cover it according to custom. A well-tended appearance was not merely a matter of vanity, it was seen as a reflection of one's moral character and self-discipline. Once personal grooming was complete, attention turned to the hearth. If the fire had been properly banked the night before, a few gentle breaths or pokes of the poker would revive the embers. If not, a new fire had to be painstakingly lit using flint, steel, and tinder, a daily struggle that underscored how central fire was to survival. The warmth of the rekindled hearth signaled the true start of the day. Breakfast, while not elaborate by modern standards, was still an important ritual. For the poor, it might consist of stale bread soaked in ale or milk, a small piece of cheese, or a weak broth. Those in better circumstances might enjoy warm porridges, fresh bread, or even small portions of meat or fish. Regardless of the fare, meals were often begun with a short prayer, reinforcing gratitude and humility. In many homes, the morning meal was shared communally, allowing family members to discuss the day's plans, assign chores, and share news or concerns. For farm families, these discussions centered around livestock, planting, and weather predictions, a crucial topic, since the entire day's labor depended heavily on the whims of nature. Children had their own morning routines. In wealthier families, tutors might arrive early to begin lessons in reading, writing, and religious instruction. In poorer households, children quickly joined in the day's work, feeding animals, gathering eggs, fetching water, or assisting in whatever tasks the adults assigned. Monasteries operated on precise schedules. After matins, monks would often continue with lauds, another set of prayers performed just as the sun rose. The entire day was structured around these divine offices, with strict times for labor, study, meals, and additional prayer services. Each morning was a continuation of disciplined devotion that left little room for idleness. The opening hours of the day also included essential safety rituals. Doors unbarred for daylight were checked for signs of tampering during the night. Livestock pens and gardens were inspected for damage or theft. Wells were examined to ensure that the community's water source remained pure and uncontaminated, a vital concern, since foul water could lead to deadly outbreaks of illness. For tradesmen and merchants, mornings were critical for setting up their stalls or preparing their shops. Markets opened early, bustling with buyers and sellers exchanging goods, gossip, and news from neighboring towns. Here, too, certain superstitions guided their activities. Many believed that the first sale of the day set the tone for the rest of their business, so prices might be lowered early to encourage a good start. The morning also offered opportunities for legal matters, since local lords or city magistrates often held court early in the day. Villagers might gather to settle disputes, register property claims, or address accusations before returning to their fields or workshops. Another important ritual was the ringing of bells. Church bells marked the hours of prayer and work, but they also served as a community clock, informing everyone that the day had begun. The sound of bells ringing through villages and towns each morning was a constant, reassuring rhythm of life. Despite these many tasks, mornings could also be times of quiet reflection. Those with fields to tend often walked through the early morning mists in near silence, accompanied only by birdsong and the distant sounds of village life awakening. This peaceful solitude was valued by many, seen as a time to commune with God or simply to gather one's thoughts before the bustle of the day truly began. For medieval people, the morning was a moment of renewal and, often, of deep gratitude. They had survived another night, something never guaranteed in a world filled with danger, uncertainty, and mystery. With the sun climbing higher, life resumed its busy pace, and the rituals of morning faded into the labors of the day. The medieval night was not simply the absence of light, it was an entirely different world. When the sun sank beneath the horizon, the world transformed into a realm of shadows, whispers, and uncertainty. For people of the Middle Ages, nighttime was filled with powerful superstitions, strange creatures, and unseen forces that could either protect or destroy. In a world where science was still in its infancy, the darkness became the canvas upon which fears, beliefs, and ancient myths were projected. Superstition was woven into the fabric of daily life, but it became most potent after sunset. Every creaking floorboard, distant howl, or sudden chill was loaded with meaning. The unseen world of spirits, demons, witches, and wandering souls seemed most active in the vulnerable hours of night. One of the most deeply rooted fears was that of wandering spirits. It was widely believed that souls, who died tragically, violently, or without proper Christian rites were doomed to roam the earth after dark. These restless spirits, often called revenants, could appear to the living, bringing messages of unfinished business or simply sowing terror. Some were thought to knock on doors, moan through the streets, or be glimpsed wandering graveyards in the moonlight. To guard against these spirits, people used a variety of protective charms. Small crosses, amulets inscribed with prayers, and holy relics were commonly placed near windows, doorways, and beds. Some believe that placing iron objects, such as knives or horseshoes, near sleeping places could repel restless souls, as iron was thought to have protective properties against the supernatural. Equally feared were witches, who were believed to draw their power from the darkness. The night was said to be their domain, a time when they could conduct secret meetings, perform unholy rituals, and call upon demonic forces. Many believe that witches could send curses from afar, cause livestock to sicken, or even enter homes unseen to steal, poison, or harm children. Because of these fears, communities remained vigilant after dark. Some people hung sprigs of herbs like rosemary, rowan, or garlic near entrances, believing these would ward off witches and evil. Others scratched protective symbols into door frames, or scattered salt across thresholds. Salt, especially, was seen as a purifying substance capable of blocking malevolent forces. One of the most chilling beliefs involved nightmare demons known as mare or incubi and succubi. These malevolent beings were thought to sit upon the chest of a sleeping victim, suffocating them and causing terrifying dreams. What we now call sleep paralysis was interpreted as a supernatural attack. Victims would awaken unable to move, convinced they were being pinned by an invisible creature. To protect themselves from such entities, many people recited prayers before bed or kept blessed objects under their pillows. Clergy might perform blessings over beds, and families often invoked saints, particularly Saint Benedict or Saint Michael, to guard them through the dangerous night. The fear of vampires, or at least vampire-like creatures, also haunted medieval minds, though not always in the form we recognize today. In Eastern European regions, tales spread of the dead rising from graves to feed on the living. These beings, known by various names, strigoi, upir, or naxurer, were blamed for mysterious deaths, unexplained illnesses, and livestock dying overnight. Burial practices reflected these fears. Some bodies were buried with heavy stones, placed over them to prevent rising. Others were interred with stakes through the chest, their mouths stuffed with soil, coins, or even garlic to block the return of their souls. These extreme measures reflected a profound terror of the dead refusing to stay dead. Even animals were not immune from superstition. Black cats, for example, were commonly associated with witchcraft and thought to be witches' familiars, spirits that assisted in magical deeds. Owls, whose haunting cries pierced the silence of night, were seen as omens of death. Wolves and wild dogs roaming near villages stirred primal fears of being hunted, or devoured under the cloak of darkness. Weather phenomena were also interpreted through a lens of superstition. Sudden winds, eerie fogs, or flashes of lightning at night were often seen as signs of divine wrath or demonic activity. People watched the sky carefully, believing that nature itself could reveal the struggles of good and evil, playing out invisibly in the heavens. The very structure of medieval towns reflected these nocturnal anxieties. Walls, gates, and heavy doors were built not just to keep out invaders, but to hold back the dangers of the night. Gates were often shut at dusk, and curfews were strictly enforced. To be caught outside after dark without good reason invited suspicion, or worse, accusations of criminal or supernatural intent. In rural areas, night watchmen and dogs patrolled villages to guard against both human threats and imagined ones. Their presence offered a fragile sense of security, though few could truly relax while the world slept. Families huddled together behind locked doors, hoping that their protective charms, prayers, and preparations would be enough to see them safely through to morning. Among the most peculiar beliefs was the notion that the night air itself was dangerous. The concept of miasma, bad air thought to carry disease, meant that people often kept windows shuttered at night, even in summer. Breezes from swamps, forests, or graveyards were especially feared. Those who ventured out after dark sometimes carried aromatic herbs, or sponges soaked in vinegar, believing these would filter and purify the air they breathed. Stories passed down through generations added layers to these fears. Tales of phantom riders, headless spirits, haunted crossroads, and cursed woods kept children and adults alike from straying far after dusk. Many of these stories served as cautionary tales, reinforcing social norms and discouraging risky behavior after dark. One widespread myth involved will-o'-the-wisps, mysterious lights seen flickering in marshes and bogs at night. These ghostly glows were said to lure travelers off paths, leading them to their deaths. Today we understand them as ignited gases from decaying organic matter, but to medieval eyes, they were the work of mischievous spirits or even malevolent fairies. Fairy lore added another dimension to the superstitions of night. Although often associated with beauty and enchantment, fairies were also feared for their capricious nature. At night, they were believed to steal away children, swap infants for changelings, or ancient travelers to wander lost for hours or even days. Ringing church bells was thought to drive these creatures away, as was carrying cold iron, or wearing one's clothing inside out. Another deeply unsettling belief concerned the wild hunt, a spectral procession of ghostly riders, hounds, and supernatural figures galloping across the night sky. Those who heard the hunt were told to lie flat on the ground and remain still, lest they be swept up into its ranks, or cursed by the otherworldly host. This myth, shared across many European cultures, captured the night's potent mix of awe and terror. Clerics and theologians worked hard to combat many of these superstitions, encouraging people to put their faith in God rather than in charms and folk rituals. Yet, even among the devout, old beliefs lingered stubbornly. In isolated villages and among the peasantry, the lines between Christian teachings and pre-Christian folklore often blurred, creating a rich and complex nighttime mythology. Midwives, herbalists, and wise women often acted as intermediaries, blending religious practices with ancient customs. They provided charms, amulets, and whispered advice on how to avoid nocturnal dangers. Their knowledge was both sought after and feared, and accusations of witchcraft sometimes arose from their association with these old ways. Even dreams were saturated with supernatural significance. Nighttime visions were interpreted as messages from the divine, warnings from the dead, or signs of demonic temptation. Entire books were dedicated to the interpretation of dreams, and some people sought the counsel of monks or mystics to decipher particularly troubling ones. In monasteries, night offered its own spiritual challenges. Monks rose for midnight prayers, believing that vigil at this vulnerable hour helped hold back the forces of darkness. Yet, even in these sanctuaries, reports of strange sights, ghostly apparitions, and demonic temptations filled monastic chronicles. The medieval world was one where light represented safety, order, and divine protection, while darkness embodied chaos, danger, and the unknown. Every flickering candle, every prayer whispered before bed, and every carefully placed amulet reflected a culture struggling to guard itself from the invisible threats of the night. Today, with our electric lights, locked doors, and scientific understanding, it is easy to forget how deeply terrifying the night once was. But for the people of the Middle Ages, every sunset marked the start of a battle, a nightly struggle not just against thieves or wild animals, but against a vast, invisible world filled with ancient fears. As the sun dipped below the horizon each evening in medieval Europe, a powerful force came to dominate both the hearts and habits of the people: religion. The medieval world was steeped in Christian belief, and this faith colored every corner of life, none more so than the long and certain hours of night. For medieval people, nightfall wasn't simply the absence of light. It was the threshold to a realm where the boundaries between the living and the spiritual world blurred. Religion provided comfort, structure, and protection as they faced the terrors lurking in the darkness. The church taught that God's light stood in opposition to the dangers of night. Daylight was associated with divine order, while night symbolized temptation, sin, and chaos. As the sun set, people instinctively turned toward God for safety. Evening prayers were not optional, they were essential, protective acts. Every home, from humble peasant cottages to grand manors, paused to kneel and recite prayers before bed. The compline, the final church service of the day, was particularly focused on guarding the soul through the vulnerable hours of darkness. "Guide us waking, O Lord, and guard us sleeping," was whispered countless times across countless medieval bedsides. Families often gathered to say the Lord's Prayer, the Hail Mary, and personal devotions before retiring for the night. These prayers were seen not just as rituals but as spiritual shields against the devil and his minions, who were believed to roam most freely at night. Monasteries maintained a more formal, unbroken rhythm of prayer throughout the night. The divine office divided the 24-hour day into periods of worship, and monks awakened in the middle of the night to perform matins or vigils. This nighttime prayer wasn't simply pious discipline, it was spiritual warfare. While ordinary people slept, monks battled the darkness through chant, scripture, and devotion. Even as villagers slept, they knew that, somewhere in a monastery, voices were rising in psalms, keeping watch over the world while the forces of evil prowled. This brought comfort to many laypeople, who felt spiritually supported even in their most vulnerable hours. The knowledge that prayer continued unceasingly was seen as one of the great pillars that held back total darkness. The fear of nocturnal temptation and sin was also deeply ingrained. The night was considered especially dangerous for the soul. Idleness, lustful dreams, and demonic whispers were believed to increase after dark. Sleep itself was thought to weaken a person's spiritual defenses. To counter this, many people kept crucifixes near their beds, made the sign of the cross before closing their eyes, or murmured protective psalms as they drifted into sleep. Particularly devout individuals went to great lengths to avoid sinning even while asleep. They might sleep fully clothed to avoid the shame of improper exposure if called upon suddenly. They believed that even the posture and modesty of sleep had religious consequences. Dreams filled with lust, fear, or anger were sometimes interpreted as signs of spiritual weakness or even demonic influence. Religious imagery played a central role in creating a sense of safety at night. Sacred icons, crosses, and paintings of saints were placed prominently in bedrooms and around doorways. Many believed these holy images acted as a barrier that demons could not cross. Some households displayed small statues of the Virgin Mary or Saint Michael, who was widely viewed as a fierce protector against evil. These items were both visible symbols of faith and invisible shields against unseen terrors. One of the most profound nighttime religious fears was that of dying unprepared during sleep. Death could arrive silently in the night, and if a person passed away without confessing sins or receiving last rites, their soul was thought to be at great risk. This fear drove many to perform personal confessions before bed or to pray for forgiveness nightly. To die in one's sleep unshriven was among the most terrifying possibilities of medieval life. The Church encouraged this nightly mindfulness of death with the Latin phrase, memento mori, remember that you will die. This was not meant to instill dread, but to remind people to keep their souls ready for judgment at any hour. Even the simple act of lying down was sometimes accompanied by whispered prayers, committing one's soul to God in case of sudden death during sleep. The sacraments themselves played a role in nighttime security. Holy water, blessed during church services, was often sprinkled around the home at night. Families might dip their fingers into small fonts before bed, making the sign of the cross upon themselves and their children. This ritual was believed to protect not only the body, but the very soul from harm as they slept. Relics of saints, small bone fragments, pieces of cloth, or objects associated with holy figures, were highly sought after for their protective powers. The more significant the saint, the more powerful the relic was believed to be. Pilgrims traveled vast distances to acquire such objects, bringing them home to safeguard their families from nighttime demons, diseases, and misfortune. The ringing of church bells served both practical and spiritual purposes. Bells rang not only to mark the time of prayer but also to drive away evil. The sound of the bell was thought to terrify demons and scatter malevolent spirits that might lurk near homes and villages. During thunderstorms, believed to be caused by supernatural forces, church bells were often rung through the night in hopes of protecting the community from disaster. When night brought illness or childbirth, two events deeply tied to the divine, priests might be summoned at any hour. The administration of last rites to the dying or baptism to a newborn was often an urgent matter that could not wait for daylight. Families relied on the presence of clergy to intercede with God directly during these critical moments. Religious festivals and saints' feast days carried special significance after dark. On important holy nights, entire communities might gather for processions, vigils, or night masses. Candles and lanterns lit the streets as hymns filled the air, pushing back the darkness both literally and spiritually. These events served as powerful reminders that God's light remained present, even during the most intimidating hours. The fear of purgatory and restless souls also shaped nighttime behavior. Prayers for the dead were often recited before sleep, with families begging God to release their loved ones from purgatory's torments. It was believed that the dead sometimes visited the living at night to request prayers or penance on their behalf. Stories of ghostly apparitions knocking on windows or calling names from outside were deeply unsettling yet entirely believable in the medieval imagination. The clergy frequently preached about the dangers of nocturnal sin and spiritual laziness. Slothfulness, gluttony, drunkenness, and sexual immorality were all believed to thrive under the cover of night. The devil's influence was thought to peak in these hours when the body was tired and moral resolve weakened. These teachings instilled a vigilant, watchful approach to both sleep and nighttime conduct. Interestingly, dreams themselves were sometimes seen as divine messages. The Bible contained many stories of God speaking through dreams. Medieval people often sought priests, monks, or even traveling mystics to help interpret particularly vivid or unsettling dreams. Some dreams were believed to offer warnings, predict future events, or reflect spiritual dangers that required prayer and penance to avoid. In more extreme cases, visions or nightmares led to fears of demonic possession. People who experienced recurring night terrors, paralysis, or strange behaviors while asleep were sometimes thought to be afflicted by evil forces. This could result in exorcisms or ongoing religious rituals, performed by clergy to cleanse the individual's soul and protect them from further attack. The medieval understanding of the cosmos itself contributed to religious nighttime practices. The night sky, with its stars, planets, and comets, was believed to reflect God's grand design and occasionally his warnings. Unusual celestial events, such as eclipses or meteors, were interpreted as omens of divine judgment, prompting many communities to hold nighttime vigils of prayer and fasting. Even the layout of medieval villages reflected religious protection at night. Churches were often placed at the center of town, towering above other buildings like spiritual lighthouses. Some communities had religious processions that circled the village borders after sunset, consecrating the ground and creating an invisible wall of prayer to guard against demonic intrusion. At its core, religion provided a sense of cosmic order amid nighttime uncertainty. It offered explanations for the unexplainable, comfort for the fearful, and a practical roadmap for daily and nightly life. While the physical night remained filled with dangers, the spiritual light of faith provided medieval people with hope, protection, and reassurance that no matter how dark the world became, God remained present. Thus, as villagers extinguished their candles, locked their doors, and settled into bed, they did not simply surrender to sleep. They placed their souls into God's hands, trusting that His divine mercy would guard them through the silent, shadowed hours until dawn's first light broke the power of darkness once again. As the last streaks of sunlight faded and the medieval world plunged into darkness, an entirely different set of fears stirred in the hearts of its people, fears not of spirits or demons, but of human predators. The cover of night offered opportunity to those who thrived on mischief, lawlessness, and desperation. In a world with limited law enforcement, rudimentary lighting, and few safe havens after dark, the dangers posed by thieves, bandits, and criminals loomed large. The night belonged to criminals as much as it belonged to superstition. Darkness concealed identity, masked movement, and provided perfect conditions for unlawful acts. Even in the most tightly knit villages, people rarely ventured outside after sundown unless absolutely necessary. The chance of encountering danger multiplied with every step away from the safety of one's home. In the countryside, bandits and highwaymen haunted the roads, waiting for travelers or merchants foolish enough to journey after dark. Roads were often nothing more than rough tracks, through forests or open fields, completely unlit, with plenty of cover for ambush. A lone rider or cart could be easily surrounded by armed robbers, stripped of goods, and left stranded or worse. These attacks were not always random. Some bandit groups operated in loosely organized gangs, setting up traps and coordinating strikes. Merchants, pilgrims, and messengers were particularly vulnerable. They often carried valuables such as coin, jewelry, or trade goods that could fetch high prices. Some bandits worked with inside information, knowing the movements of wealthy targets in advance. A successful ambush could provide weeks or months of stolen income. City streets were hardly safer. As night fell, towns and cities often shut their gates to outsiders, but those within the walls still faced risks. Narrow, twisting alleys created endless hiding places for thieves and cutthroats. Poor lighting meant that even a few steps from one's home could place a person in mortal danger. Pickpockets and footpads prowled the urban darkness, targeting anyone traveling late. Knives, clubs, or simple brute force allowed these criminals to rob travelers of their purses, cloaks, or belongings with terrifying speed. With little chance of rescue, victims often had no choice but to submit. Homes, too, were frequent targets. Burglars used the cover of night to break into houses, barns, and storehouses. Windows were often shuttered and doors barred, but crude locks and simple construction made many buildings vulnerable. Thieves were known to use small children or thin accomplices, who could slip through narrow openings and unlock doors from the inside. In response, many households adopted elaborate security rituals. Doors were double-bolted, shutters were reinforced, and iron bars secured cellars and storerooms. Guard dogs were highly prized, their keen senses providing an early warning system. Some wealthy families even hired armed night watchmen to patrol their properties until dawn. The danger was not merely theft, it was often violence. Many robbers carried weapons and were not hesitant to use them if challenged. Assaults, stabbings, and even murders were tragically common outcomes of nighttime crime. Few witnesses meant few consequences for the perpetrators. Victims, if found at all, were often discovered by daylight. Their attackers long vanished into the shadows. The absence of organized policing made law enforcement highly localized and limited. In villages, communal watch groups, or volunteer constables attempted to keep order after dark. These men were usually poorly equipped and lightly armed, carrying lanterns, staffs, or horns to raise alarm if trouble arose. Their mere presence sometimes deterred crime, but not always. Larger towns employed official night watchmen, whose job was to patrol streets, monitor suspicious activity, and enforce curfews. These watchmen called out the passing hours, checked locked gates, and often carried bells or rattles to signal their position. However, their effectiveness varied. Some were dedicated and brave, while others were corrupt, easily bribed, or too fearful to intervene against dangerous criminals. In many cities, curfews were strictly enforced to prevent nighttime roaming. People caught outside without permission after dark faced fines, arrest, or suspicion of criminal intent. The curfew bell signaled the closing of taverns and public spaces, driving people indoors, where they were theoretically safe. Taverns and aleahouses, however, were often hotbeds of nocturnal crime themselves. These drinking establishments operated well into the night, attracting a rough crowd of gamblers, prostitutes, and criminals. Fights broke out easily, leading to injuries or deaths that were rarely investigated thoroughly. Drunkenness lowered inhibitions and made patrons easy prey for pickpockets or swindlers. Prostitution, while officially condemned by the church, thrived under the cover of darkness. Brothels operated in many towns, their presence tolerated by officials, who saw them as a necessary evil. However, these establishments were often tied to criminal networks involved in theft, blackmail, and occasionally violent crime. Night also provided cover for organized criminal guilds and gangs. In some cities, these groups formed sophisticated operations with leadership structures, secret symbols, and carefully planned activities. They controlled illicit markets, enforced debts, and engaged in protection rackets that terrorized merchants and citizens alike. Travel between towns after dark was exceptionally perilous. Beyond bandits, travelers risked getting lost on poorly marked paths, attacked by wild animals, or stranded by broken carts or tired horses. Many travelers preferred to seek shelter at monasteries, inns, or hospitable farmsteads rather than press on into unknown territory as night fell. Even religious pilgrims faced these dangers. Though protected in theory by their spiritual mission, pilgrims were frequent targets for robbers, who saw their possessions as easy spoils. Traveling in groups offered some protection, but isolated individuals rarely escaped unscathed. In response to growing crime, some rulers attempted to strengthen nighttime law enforcement. In England, the Assize of Arms and the Statute of Winchester, 1285, required all able-bodied men to keep weapons at home and participate in maintaining public order, especially after dark. Yet these laws often proved difficult to enforce consistently. Punishments for nighttime crime were severe. Thieves caught in the act could face flogging, mutilation, branding, or execution. Repeat offenders might have hands or ears cut off to mark them as criminals for life. In some cases, public executions were held specifically to deter would-be offenders from daring to steal under cover of darkness. The fear of retribution by victimized communities also played a role. In villages, known criminals could find themselves ostracized, publicly shamed, or even lynched if authorities failed to act. Reputation was everything, and accusations of nocturnal theft carried long-lasting consequences. Not all nighttime crime was violent or motivated by greed. In some cases, people resorted to petty theft or trespassing simply to survive. Hungry peasants might steal food from wealthier neighbors' gardens, orchards, or storehouses. These acts were still illegal, but often carried a degree of sympathy from fellow villagers struggling under similar hardships. Rumors of sabotage and espionage also swirled in medieval towns. Rival merchants might hire saboteurs to destroy competitors' property under cover of night. Political enemies sometimes employed spies or assassins to carry out secret missions, knowing that nighttime provided their best chance of success. In some areas, religious persecution added yet another layer to nighttime fear. Minority groups such as Jews or heretics were occasionally accused of secret nocturnal crimes, poisoning wells, casting spells, or conspiring against Christian rulers. These false accusations often led to mob violence, pogroms, or brutal crackdowns by authorities. Amidst all this danger, one constant remained: most people stayed inside after dark unless absolutely necessary. Families clustered together, doors barred, windows shuttered, and candles extinguished as they waited for morning light. Sleep offered no guarantees of safety, but it was far safer than venturing into the shadowed world outside. Thus, medieval night became a time of dual fear. On one hand, the supernatural haunted the imagination with demons, spirits, and restless souls. On the other, very real threats of crime and violence roamed streets and paths, emboldened by darkness. Both forms of fear intertwined, leaving the people of the Middle Ages deeply cautious and highly protective of the night's mysteries. In the medieval world, as much as darkness was feared, the light itself held its own unique set of dangers. The flicker of flame, so necessary for survival in the absence of modern electricity, was both a blessing and a terrifying threat, especially during the long, fragile hours of the night. Fire was life. Fire was warmth. Fire was light in an otherwise shadowed world. Yet, fire was also a destroyer that could reduce entire towns to ash in the time it took for a single ember to catch on straw. Medieval people lived in close proximity to flame every day. Their homes were heated by open hearths, their meals cooked over open fires, and their nights illuminated by flickering candles, torches, and oil lamps. While these flames brought comfort and necessity, they carried with them a constant and pervasive risk. A single accident, an errant spark, or a gust of wind, could spell catastrophe. The very construction of medieval homes made them vulnerable. Many houses, especially in villages and towns, were built with timber frames, thatched roofs, and wattle and daub walls, materials that were extremely flammable. Straw bedding, wooden furniture, woolen fabrics, and stacks of hay for livestock all created a perfect fuel supply for any fire that managed to escape its controlled space. Nighttime increased the danger exponentially. In the dark, visibility was limited, and sleepy or exhausted household members could easily mishandle flame. A candle left burning too close to a tapestry. An oil lamp knocked over by a restless sleeper. A spark carried by the wind through an open window. Any of these could ignite a blaze while the household lay vulnerable in their slumber. The design of urban areas made matters worse. Towns and cities were often densely packed, with buildings pressed closely together along narrow, twisting streets. In many towns, upper stories of houses jutted outward over the streets, their roofs nearly touching those across the way. If fire broke out in one home, it could leap easily from rooftop to rooftop, devouring entire neighborhoods within hours. The great fires that ravaged medieval towns were frequent and devastating. Entire communities lived under the ever-present threat of sudden destruction. One of the most infamous examples, though from a slightly later period, was the Great Fire of London in 1666, which demonstrated the terrifying speed at which fire could consume an entire city. Yet smaller, equally devastating fires plagued medieval settlements long before and after that event. Preventing fire was a communal responsibility. Many towns implemented strict fire ordinances. In some places, town criers walked the streets at dusk, calling out reminders for residents to cover your fire, meaning to safely extinguish or bank their hearths for the night. The term curfew itself comes from the Old French couvre-feu, literally, cover fire. To comply, families would rake ashes over the glowing embers of their hearths, reducing the risk of open flames while preserving enough heat to easily rekindle the fire the next morning. This practice was a nightly ritual, deeply ingrained in medieval domestic life. Even so, accidents still happened with alarming frequency. Night watchmen played a key role in fire prevention. In many towns, part of their duty was to patrol the streets, listen for crackling flames, sniff for smoke, and alert the town if fire broke out. If flames were spotted, bells were rung furiously, and all able-bodied citizens were expected to respond immediately. Firefighting in the medieval period was a crude and desperate affair. There were no organized fire departments, no pressurized water systems, and certainly no specialized equipment. Buckets, leather water bags, axes, hooks, and sheer human determination were the only tools available. Citizens formed hastily assembled bucket brigades, passing water hand to hand from wells or rivers to the site of the blaze. In many cases, firefighters resorted to demolishing buildings in the path of the flames, creating fire breaks to halt the inferno's advance. This meant sacrificing homes and livelihoods in hopes of saving what remained of the town. The chaos, confusion, and sheer terror of a nighttime fire engulfing a medieval town are almost impossible to imagine fully. Inside the home, the fear of fire shaped even the smallest details of daily life. Candles were placed in heavy holders, or wall sconces to minimize the risk of tipping. Torches were secured high on walls. Oil lamps were often designed with covered reservoirs to reduce spillage. Parents taught their children from a young age to respect fire's danger. Despite these precautions, countless medieval families experienced the horror of waking to the crackle of flames and the suffocating sting of smoke in the middle of the night. Escape was not always possible. Narrow staircases, barred windows, and thick smoke often trapped victims inside their burning homes. Entire families might perish before neighbors even realized a fire had broken out. Livestock, too, frequently perished in barn fires, an economic disaster for peasants, whose survival depended on their few animals. Barns filled with dry hay, straw, and wooden beams ignited with terrifying speed. A single spark from a lantern could reduce a farmer's livelihood to ashes within minutes. The psychological impact of fire was deeply rooted in medieval culture and superstition. Many saw fire not only as a natural hazard, but as a form of divine punishment. Fires that swept through communities were often interpreted as signs of God's anger, punishments for the sins of the town or its leaders. Priests might lead public processions of repentance after major fires, urging citizens to confess their sins and amend their ways to avoid further divine wrath. Some communities even held special masses dedicated to invoking God's protection against future fires. At the same time, fire was used as a tool of justice and fear. Public burnings, though horrifying by today's standards, were common in medieval Europe. Heretics, witches, and criminals convicted of certain offenses were sometimes sentenced to death by fire. These gruesome executions served both as punishment and as a chilling deterrent to others. The association of fire with both purification and destruction gave it immense symbolic power. Religious texts described hell as a place of unquenchable fire, further embedding the fear of flames into the medieval psyche. To many, fire was both the wrath of God and the instrument of eternal torment. The fear of nighttime fire extended to monasteries, castles, and even royal palaces. Though constructed of stone, these grand structures still contain vast quantities of wood in their roofs, floors, furnishings, and tapestries. A fire in a castle's kitchen could easily spread throughout the entire keep if not quickly contained. Special precautions were often taken in such places. Monks were assigned to monitor hearths at night. Castles had stone-lined kitchens separate from living quarters whenever possible. Chimneys were carefully designed to reduce the risk of embers escaping into flammable roof timbers. Merchants who dealt in flammable goods like cloth, oil, or grain were required to follow strict regulations about storage and handling to minimize fire hazards. Some cities created designated areas for certain trades to isolate fire risks from residential neighborhoods. Insurance against fire loss was rare, leaving victims to rebuild entirely from scratch. After a major fire, communities often rallied together to assist the displaced, providing shelter, food, and materials for reconstruction. The generosity of neighbors and the support of the local church were crucial for survivors to rebuild their lives. Despite these ever-present dangers, the use of fire at night was unavoidable. Candles lit homes for reading, prayer, and simple movement through darkened rooms. Hearths provided warmth against the chill of medieval winters. Torches guided travelers down city streets or country roads. The medieval world lived and slept under the flickering, fragile glow of open flame, always aware of the risk, yet dependent on its light. Thus, every bedtime in the Middle Ages was a delicate balance, a final check of the fire, a whispered prayer for safety, and a hope that the fragile peace of the night would not be broken by the smell of smoke or the sound of crackling wood. Even now, as we live surrounded by electric lights, smoke detectors, and fire departments, the echoes of that ancient fear remain buried in our instincts, a deep-seated respect for fire's dual nature, inherited from ancestors who once faced nightly peril from the very flames that helped them survive.